The snow was falling hard in 1874, but it wasn't the cold that could kill you. It was the people. Williams Boone knew that. He was a man made of silence, his words packed away years ago with the memory of his wife and son. He swung down from his horse, the leather groaning in the frigid air, and that's when he saw them. Two little girls, no older than 7, standing barefoot in the snow. Their dresses were thin as cobwebs, their faces raw from the wind, and they were invisible. People walked right past them. A shopkeeper with a belly full of breakfast slammed his door, muttering about the Harper brats. A woman wrapped in a thick fur coat pulled her own child away, hissing that their mother's sin was a stain you could catch. The girls just stood there, their hands empty, their eyes downcast. Williams had seen starving coyotes with more fight in them. He was about to turn away because his own pockets were near empty and his heart was a frozen chunk of rock. But then the smaller one, her voice a tiny crackle of ice, whispered to the empty street, "Mama is dying." Her sister added, her lips blue, "We haven't eaten in 3 days." The words hit Williams like a physical blow. He didn't want to feel it. He'd spent years building a wall inside himself, brick by silent brick. But the whisper of a starving child was the one sound that could still get through. He saw his own mother's face, buried under prairie dirt for 2 decades. He remembered the gnawing emptiness of his own belly as a boy. Cursing under his breath, he walked into the mercantile. The storekeeper watched him with suspicious eyes as he spent the last of his coins on a loaf of bread and a strip of dried beef. When he came back out, the girls were still there, shivering like 2 little sparrows. He knelt down, the joints in his legs popping, and held out the food. He didn't say a word, their eyes, wide and wild with a fear of kindness, locked onto the bread. Their tiny red fingers snatched it and they tore at it, stuffing it into their mouths like they were afraid he'd change his mind and take it back. A hot wave of shame washed over Williams. Not for them. For this town, for every soul who saw them and chose to see nothing. "Where's your mama?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. They didn't speak. They just pointed. A small, trembling finger aimed toward the woods, where the trees were thick and the snow swallowed the world whole. The path was barely there, just a suggestion of a trail leading away from the town and into the deep, dark woods. The girls walked ahead of him, their small bodies determined, leaving tiny, barefoot prints in the fresh powder. Williams followed, his horse trailing behind, the cold seeping into his bones. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. His cabin was cold, his food was almost gone, and whatever trouble this family was in, it wasn't his. But he kept walking. He kept following the 2 little ghosts through the trees. The cabin they led him to was a wreck. It was more of a pile of rotting wood leaning against the wind. The roof sagged like a broken back, and the door hung from a single leather hinge, swinging and groaning with every gust. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and wet rot. A fire in the hearth was little more than a pile of glowing red eyes. And on a pallet of rags in the corner, a woman lay dying. He had heard the name Nazie Harper whispered in town, always followed by a sneer or a laugh. A widow, an outcast, a sinner. They painted her as a woman who had brought ruin upon herself. But looking at her now, Williams saw something else. He saw a fighter. Even with her cheeks hollowed out by hunger and her skin pale as ash, you could see the ghost of a stunning beauty. Her dark hair was a tangled mess on the rags, and she shivered violently under a thin blanket. The girls ran to her side. "Mama," they whispered, their voices full of a desperate hope. He brought food. A man brought food. Williams felt his throat clench. He knelt by the pallet, broke off a piece of bread, and held it to her lips. She tried to sit up but collapsed back with a pained groan. Her hand, frail and burning with fever, brushed against his. The contact was like a jolt of lightning. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glazed with sickness, but deep inside them, a spark still fought for life. It was a look of pure disbelief. You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice broken. "They'll ruin you too." Williams didn't answer. He had never put much stock in what they said. He fed her the bread, piece by tiny piece. He took the kindling he'd gathered on the walk and brought the fire back to life, chasing the worst of the shadows from the crumbling room. The girls, their hunger finally quieted, curled up against their mother and fell into an exhausted sleep. Williams watched the flames dance, listening to the wind howl outside. He knew what was happening back in town. He knew the whispers were already slithering through the saloon, across the counters of the shops. Martha Hensley, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife, would be holding court, her voice dripping with venom. "Williams Boone," she'd be saying, "taken in by that Harper woman. He'll learn. She'll drag him down to hell with her." And the town would listen. They always listened. Williams knew that the moment he'd offered that loaf of bread, he'd stepped off a cliff. There was no climbing back up. He was an outcast now, same as them. And as he looked at the sleeping woman and her 2 little girls, nestled in the fragile warmth of the fire, he felt something stir in the frozen wasteland of his chest. It wasn't hope. It was something far more dangerous. It was the beginning of a fight. Days turned into a week, and the week bled into 2. The snow piled up, burying the world in a deep, white silence. But the silence in town was different. It was a heavy, loaded silence, filled with accusing eyes. Men Williams had known for years would now only give him a stiff nod before turning away. Women would hurry their children to the other side of the street as he passed, as if he carried a plague. He was no longer Williams Boone, the quiet ranch hand. He was the man who helped the Harper woman. He was tainted. He didn't care. Every morning he'd make the trek to the collapsing cabin. He brought broth. He brought firewood. He brought old boards he'd scavenged to patch the holes in the roof. He worked without a word, his hammer blows echoing in the frozen woods. Under his care, a miracle started to happen. Color began to return to Nazy's cheeks. The light came back into her eyes. She started sitting up, then standing. The girls, fed and warm for the first time in months, began to laugh. It was a timid sound at first, but it grew stronger each day, filling the broken cabin with a sound Williams hadn't realized he'd missed so much. He still didn't talk much, but Nazy started to. She'd watch him, her eyes filled with a gratitude he didn't know how to accept. One evening, as the fire popped and hissed, she finally told him her story. "It was Martha Hensley," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She started the rumors. My husband, Jedediah, he had business with her husband, a bad land deal. When Jedediah died, she wanted our property. She told everyone I was a temptress, that I drove men to ruin. She said I was wicked." Her hands trembled as she spoke. "The town, they believed her. The Reverend himself said I was a stain on their good community. They cast me out. They left me and my girls to starve." Williams listened, his jaw tight. He'd seen the greed in Martha Hensley's eyes. He'd seen the weakness in the Reverend. He looked at the nail he was about to hammer into a loose floorboard. Instead of speaking, he drove it home with a single, furious blow. It was all the answer she needed, but their small pocket of peace was about to be shattered. One afternoon, a long shadow fell across the doorway. It was Sheriff Amos Pike. He sat on his horse, a big man with a cruel mouth, his badge gleaming on his chest. He looked at Williams with pure contempt. "Boone," he drawled, his voice lazy and dangerous, "the good people of this town are getting mighty tired of your charity project. They want the Harper woman gone. For good." Williams didn't move from the doorway, his hand resting on the axe he'd been using. "This is my property now, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and even. Pike's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? You'd throw your good name away for her?" He spat into the snow near Williams's feet. "I'm giving you one warning. Send her on her way, or we will." The sheriff wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving his threat hanging in the cold air. The girls, who had been hiding behind Williams, started to cry. Nazy pulled them close, her face pale with terror. That night, the wind carried a different sound, not just the howling of the winter storm, but the distant angry shouts of men. Williams looked out the patched window. Through the swirling snow he could see them, a line of torches like angry orange eyes bobbing and weaving through the trees. They were coming. Sheriff Pike was making good on his promise. He had brought a posse. Williams barred the door. He grabbed his rifle. His hands were steady. He had spent years running from a fight, but now one had found him. Maisie stood behind him, her face a mask of terror, but her back was straight. She was done running, too. The girls were huddled in the corner, silent. The torchlight washed over the cabin, casting huge, dancing shadows. "Boone!" It was Pike's voice, booming and full of false authority. "You've been warned! We're here for the harlot!" "Send her out, or we'll burn this shack to the ground with all of you in it." Williams looked at Maisie. He looked at her little girls. He thought of the town that would let children starve. He thought of the lies that passed for truth, and he felt that frozen rock in his chest crack wide open. He raised the rifle. "She stays!" he yelled back, his voice raw with a fury he hadn't felt in a decade. A shot rang out, splintering the wood next to his head. The fight had begun. The men surged forward, a mob fueled by ignorance and hate. Williams fired back, not to kill, but to drive them back. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the small cabin. Wood splintered, men shouted. Maisie screamed as a flaming torch was thrown onto the roof, the dry wood catching instantly. The cabin was on fire. They were trapped. As smoke began to fill the room, Williams knew this wasn't just about chasing Maisie away. This was an execution. Pike wanted them all dead. But why? The story about Martha Hensley and the land, it didn't feel big enough for this level of hate. There was something else, another secret, buried under all the others. And as Pike and two of his men finally broke down the door, Williams saw something that changed everything. Around the sheriff's neck, tucked under his collar, was a thin silver chain. A chain Williams recognized. He had seen it once before, a long time ago, in the hands of Maisie's dead husband, Jedediah. The cabin was an inferno. Flames licked up the walls, and thick black smoke choked the air. Williams fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He used his rifle as a club, swinging it with desperate strength, trying to keep Pike and his men from reaching Maisie and the girls. The heat was unbearable, the noise a terrifying mix of roaring fire and snarling men. Pike lunged at him, his face twisted in a hateful sneer. "You should have left it alone, Boone," he roared over the flames. "She was never worth it." They crashed to the floor, wrestling in the dirt and embers. Williams was strong from years of hard labor, but Pike was bigger, fueled by a rage that seemed almost personal. As they struggled, the silver chain around Pike's neck broke. A small object fell to the floorboards, skittering near the firelight. It was a locket. Williams's mind raced. Jedediah's locket. He'd shown it to Williams once, years ago, bragging about the portrait of his beautiful new wife he kept inside. This was it. This was the proof Pike had been there when Jedediah died. "The locket!" Maisie screamed, pointing with a trembling finger. She had seen it too. Pike's eyes went wide with panic. He scrambled for it, but Williams was faster. He kicked it away from the sheriff's grasping hand, scooping it up. His fingers, clumsy from the fight, fumbled with the clasp. He snapped it open, but the face inside was not Maisie Harper. It was a younger, smiling Martha Hensley. A collective gasp went through the men who had crowded into the doorway. They had come to banish a sinner to uphold the town's morality. But this changed the story completely. The smoke, the fire, the fight, it all seemed to fade into the background. There was only the locket, the smiling face of the town's biggest gossip, and the sheriff's sudden, sickening silence. "It wasn't about the land, was it?" Williams growled, getting to his feet and shoving Pike back against a burning wall. "It was never about the land." Pike didn't answer. He just stared at the locket in Williams's hand, his face a mess of ash, sweat, and pure terror. "You were with her," Williams pressed, his voice like grinding stone. "You and Martha Hensley. You wanted Jedediah's land, and you wanted his wife. But Maisie wouldn't have you, so you and Martha cooked up a plan." The pieces were slamming together in Williams's head, forming a picture uglier than he could have ever imagined. The rumors were your idea. You used Martha's jealousy to turn the whole town against Nazy. You drove her out, thinking she'd come crawling to you for protection. One of the other men in the posse, a farmer named Silas, lowered his rifle. "Sheriff?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What's he talking about?" Pike's eyes darted around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "He's lying! The fire's cooked his brain!" But his voice lacked conviction. He was caught. "And when Jedediah found out about you and Martha?" Williams continued, his grip tightening on Pike's shirt. "When he threatened to expose you both? What then, Amos? Was it an accident in the woods, or did you just get tired of waiting for what you wanted?" He shoved the locket right in Pike's face. "You killed him. You killed Jedediah Harper. You murdered him, and you let this woman and her 2 little girls take the blame and freeze to death, all to cover up your dirty little secret." The truth hung in the air, thicker than the smoke. The posse members looked at each other, then at the terrified sheriff, and finally at Nazy, who was sobbing, clutching her children. They hadn't been a righteous mob. They had been pawns. They were the weapons in a murderer's cover-up. Silas, the farmer, stepped forward, his face grim. He leveled his rifle, but this time it wasn't pointing at Williams. It was pointing straight at Sheriff Amos Pike's chest. "You're a liar and a killer," Silas said, his voice filled with disgust, "and your time is up." The fight was over. The posse turned on their leader, grabbing him, tying his hands. As they dragged him out of the burning cabin, Williams rushed to get Nazy and the girls out into the snow. They stood there, coughing and shivering, watching the flames consume the last evidence of their miserable exile. The town had come for a witch hunt, but they had found a monster hiding behind a badge. Justice hadn't come from the law. It had come from a quiet man who had refused to look away. But the story wasn't over. Pike's confession led straight to Martha Hensley. The 2 of them had planned it all. Their affair, their greed, their murder of an innocent man. The town that had so easily condemned Nazy was now forced to look at the real evil that had been living among them all along. The trial was short. The evidence was undeniable. Pike and Martha were sentenced to hang. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the town. The stares Williams and Nazy received were no longer filled with hate, but with shame. People would cross the street to avoid their eyes, unable to face what they had almost let happen. A few, the braver ones, offered quiet apologies. They brought food to the new cabin Williams was building on his own land, a proper home with a strong roof and glass windows. They left toys for the girls on the porch. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. One day, when the spring thaw had begun and the snow was finally melting away, Williams stood with Nazy on the porch of their new home. The girls were laughing, chasing a butterfly in the yard. He had never been a man of many words, and he wasn't about to start now. He simply took her hand. It was all he needed to say. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her tears falling freely, but for the first time, they were tears of relief, not sorrow. They had faced down the worst of the cold, the worst of the hate, and they had found something warm and real on the other side. They had found a family. In a world full of noise and lies, sometimes the strongest thing you can be is quiet. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand your ground. And sometimes the truth is buried so deep you have to burn the whole world down just to find it. If you enjoyed this story of justice and uncovering the truth, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are always more secrets hiding in the dark, just waiting for someone to drag them into the light. And you won't want to miss the next one.